Okay, well, welcome everyone to the first of our keynotes for FTG. Our first keynote is Marie Foulston, who I'm delighted to introduce. Marie has been a huge influence on the modern understanding of games in culture and art, particularly in the UK, but really her impact has been far around the world, I think. She was the director of the Now Play This festival at Somerset House, which is a hugely successful annual games festival that brings together visions of games from really all across the medium. There's a wonderful trailer that you can watch online that I highly recommend. She was the curator of video games at the Victoria and Albert Museum, where she was responsible for the groundbreaking Design, Play, Disrupt video game exhibition. Perhaps best known to certain types of game designer and conference attendee, she's a member of the Wild Rumpus, who organizes the namesake game event, the Wild Rumpus, and also its sibling event, the Mild Rumpus, at games events all around the world. So really, Marie is one of the best people in the world for thinking about games differently, and then most importantly, finding ways to show other people these perspectives in unusual and enjoyable ways. And I'm really, really happy that she's here today to be sharing that perspective with us. So without further ado, take it away, Marie.
Thanks, Mike. Hi, yes. Good afternoon, everyone, or I guess good morning, good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from. Yes, so I am here today to talk, I guess, sort of through a couple of recent projects and work that I've been doing, and I guess my thoughts specifically pertaining to digital curation in the year 2020. So this is a talk that's kind of based on my research and my practice, that is something that for me is actively in progress and evolving. So whilst obviously this talk is very much sort of a broadcast and a presentation, it's something that I see as being actually hopefully more part of a conversation and a sort of evolution of thoughts and research and ideas. So as Mike mentioned, let's make the computer work, there we go. As Mike mentioned, traditionally I work as a curator and a creative director of playful exhibitions and events that take place in a variety of different contexts. And that's work that I've been doing for around about sort of 10 years now. I'm not going to repeat the biography or the Potter biography that Mike's just eloquently talked through, but yes, so my work is, as a curator of video games, is very much situated in bringing video games, bringing playful media, and bringing predominantly digital design into public real-world settings. And that is work that, just to give a little bit of background context, that traditionally looks a little bit like this, or sometimes looks like this if it's in a party context. This is an image from the V&A exhibition. Sometimes looks like this, people on a giant mega alphabet dance mat stitched together in a nightclub. Sometimes it looks like dragging half a car that also doubles up as an arcade cabinet into the V&A. Sometimes it looks like this, and sometimes it looks like this. So that's just a little bit of an overview of what my work looks like, I guess, in a traditional year or in a usual year, which is, as I say, bringing works into specific real world sort of public settings. But yeah, as we know, 2020 has been a different year, and there's not so much doing that sort of work in 2020 for obvious reasons. And it's interesting that for me, that as somebody who is a curator who traditionally works with the digital medium, who works with digital design and digital culture, that actually, it's surprisingly that actually a lot of my work as a curator has not been about undertaking that work within a digital context, within virtual and online exhibitions. And so this year is one where I've really had my hand forced, and I've had to think about shifting my practice to an online setting, into virtual spaces. And that for me, as well as the loss of a lot of work this year, of a lot of projects this year that were due to take place in real world settings, that it's actually pushed sort of quite this sort of existential sort of, I guess, sort of mindset upon me, in a sense that it's really pushing me to sort of challenge and think about what actually is it that I am interested in when I'm bringing games into exhibition settings. And it's strange that it's normally, when I'm questioning my desire to be a curator of video games, it's normally the video games part of that title that I'm normally questioning than I guess so much the curator part. But in the absence of that context, in the absence of that setting, that's something that I've really been sort of pushed to interrogate and to think about, why am I self-compelled towards that work, and how do I find personal meaning within that context? Or how can I still find meaning within contexts that are sort of quite radically different? And so, like, I guess for me, I'm somebody who has been sort of quite skeptical towards the context or towards the idea of digital exhibitions and virtual exhibitions. And I think the push for me to shift my practice into an online setting is one which has very much come out of necessity, which I think is something that's important for me to establish and acknowledge, in sort of understanding and respecting that there's a whole range of really amazing sort of radical practitioners and curators and artists who have been working in this space for many years and have been undertaking a range of radical work. But for me, sort of the work that I've been doing is thinking about sort of what is it about real world settings? What is it about that sort of evocation of exhibitions that sort of speaks to me? And a lot of the things that have really sort of chimed with me when I was thinking about this sort of earlier on in the year was thinking less so much about the actual experience of the exhibition of itself, or necessarily about this idea of an exhibition as being a space where knowledge or art or work is going to be conveyed to me, but thinking more about the context and actually thinking a little bit more about some of this sort of almost sort of the sort of rituals and the frictions that come with that. So thinking about when I'm going to an exhibition that I'm planning, I'm booking tickets, I'm getting dressed, I'm traveling there, I'm putting my bag in the cloakroom, I'm entering into a different space. And when I enter into that space, I know that I'm going to adopt this sort of mindset or this mode of behavior, be that learned behavior or be that sort of role-playing behavior to a certain extent. I'm sometimes there with friends, I'm sometimes there with strangers, and it sort of becomes this context for which it's a context for which, for me, that is not just necessarily about engaging with the work or engaging with different sort of meetings or different exhibitions. It's also a conduit to having a different experience with a variety of different people. And all of this sort of are things which impacts my sort of behavior, my experience within exhibitions. And so a lot of this stuff is stuff which I think when I'm thinking about a lot of digital exhibitions, when I'm thinking about those spaces, for me, a lot of work that happens online is work that, as somebody who's easily distracted, it's work that I think often might as well be happening in the middle of a motorway, because something that's happening on my screen is something that I can easily tab away from and get through to 100 different experiences or 100 different bits of content. And for me, it was realizing sort of that actually those rituals and that sort of reverence and those frictions that comes from all of that sort of additional context and build-up for real world exhibitions was actually something that I was really missing in sort of online exhibition spaces. And so I was finding it quite hard to separate the context and away from sort of the context and the social context. And so what I wanted to do was today or this afternoon was just to talk through a couple of projects which I've undertaken or as a curator during 2020, which have been sort of online exhibitions, and just talk a little bit about the experiences and thoughts behind that work and thinking about sort of what that work evoked and the experiences of undertaking it. And so I'm going to talk through two specific projects, and the first of which, as the title suggested, was photography workshops for Spacemen. So this was a project this was a workshop that was undertaken, or a virtual tour that was undertaken as part of Now Play This Festival. This was a tour that was run by Gareth Damian Martin, game designer and artist, and really a great sort of thinker and expert on games and virtual spaces and architecture. And he undertakes a lot of sort of photography workshops in video games in real world settings, but had never before undertaken one which was happening just purely in virtual locations. And so, so that's what this workshop was. It was an attempt to bring together a handful of people to undertake sort of a photography workshop virtually within a video game. So for people who aren't familiar with Now Play This, it's an experimental games festival which takes place at Somerset House on an annual basis. And so I was working in the festival as a guest director this year. And so on a usual year, this is sort of roughly sort of how the festival sort of broadly looks, sort of a range of physical exhibitions and installations. And however, in 2020, this is what Now Play This ended up looking a lot more like. This is a photograph of myself and the festival team back when it was a little bit cooler and not quite so overdone to be doing things in Animal Crossing, although I'm a huge Animal Crossing fan. So any excuse for me to run festivals or curate events in Animal Crossing is still always welcome. So this is myself and the festival team launching the festival on one of our islands to kick it off. So for us, when we approached Now Play This and thought about bringing that festival into a virtual space, we really sort of, one of the key things that we did at the beginning was to pause and to give ourselves time to reflect and think about what Now Play This means and what the sort of core aspects of Now Play This are when it is a site-specific real-world exhibition, and what from that did we still want to work towards and evoke within a virtual exhibition and within a virtual festival. And a huge part of that was sort of thinking that to bring something that is a festival which is interactive, which seeks to foster meaningful connections, that for us to purely translate that into sort of what could potentially be just a broadcast, or could quite easily have been sort of a broadcast event, that we wanted something that retained that sense of community, something that retained that sense of sort of site specificity. And so the range of events, we did a whole range of events, but specifically, as I say, the one I was going to talk through today is the virtual field trips. And we did two separate field trips. The first was with Robert Yang through Half-Life 1, and the second was the photography workshop. And these were projects which were specifically inspired by an article that was written by Everest Pipkin back in 2016. And this was an article where they talked about their experiences being taken on virtual tours within Second Life. And Everest's writing back in 2016 is something that's really stayed with me and resonated with me. That sense of role play and site specificness of being able to sort of enter into a virtual space and treat it like this site of heritage, treat it like you're going to like a National Trust property and sort of and exploring that space. And so that was that's specifically sort of the point of inspiration that we had. And so for me, running these workshops is something that sort of talking back over these frictions and talking over these limitations from real world spaces, that to run these workshops, there were things which were time bound. So in order for you to take part in this, you had to turn up at a specific point in time. And so it's not something that was happening, something you could necessarily watch in the same way sort of later on. As a participant on that tool, you had to come at a specific time. It's something that required your full attention. You can't be tapping away sort of on other browsers or doing other things, because you have to also navigate within this virtual space. So you have to be present and sort of be embodied in a way. It's an event which had a limited audience capacity that for us, I think there's a sense of what could be considered like the sort of this potential fallacy of access of digital, that because something exists on a digital platform, that you have the potential, the possibility or the potential of reaching sort of much greater audiences, because you're not bound by that sort of geographical sort of restrictions of an event. But increasing the participation, increasing the amount of attendees to an event does have a radical impact on the culture and the way that people will interact and people will sort of engage with each other within that space. And so for us, it was important to still keep that essence of community, to keep that sense of meaningful connections. And so to do these field trips, we knew that we had to limit the amount of participants, not just because of the digital requirements of the game or limitations just within the technology, but also the social restrictions. And whilst there wasn't a need to travel to the event, there was definitely sort of preparation that needed to be undertaken by participants. You need to access the game, you need to download it. You were also asked to join in a Discord to be part of the back channel sort of discussions. You had to sort of build all of this up so that when you came to this event, it sort of had this sense of existing in a moment and being something special. So all of that stuff for me sort of are things which, whilst they do not directly sort of align with the their sort of real world counterparts of an exhibition, and they're not direct comparisons, that there's elements of the frictions that you can find in real world events that can exist within virtual spaces, and they sort of reflect and connect to them, but not necessarily sort of in this directly connected way. Now, as the next slide says, I'm going to attempt to show a video, because when I embedded it into the presentation, it crashed, which I didn't want. So I'm going to try and move everybody's heads down my screen, and hopefully a video is going to play. If you give me talk amongst yourselves whilst I'm doing this. Don't talk amongst yourselves, that would be bad. VLC, there's VLC jutting in. What? Calm down, Gareth. Let's shuffle that up. There we go. That's enough of the screen, I think. Hopefully, I have hidden everybody's heads. Mike, you're going to have to nod if you can hear the audio from this, because you're the person I can see. Can you hear that audio, Mike? No. So I'll talk you through what's happening, because I can hear it. So Gareth is welcoming sort of the people to a specific location within No Man's Sky. And what he's saying to them is, right now, I'm going to issue you with with sort of a challenge or an exercise. And he wants each of the sort of 12 or so participants who are with him on the tour to go off and take a portfolio with a specific command or a specific theme. So he's asking them to sort of look in detail at something, to say like, look, you might be interested in the sky, you might be interested in the ground. So by this point, they'd already undertaken sort of an initial exercise, an initial sort of workshop, and an introduction by Gareth. And now was sort of like the building, sort of the culmination of them sort of undertaking this sort of final, a final sort of task for the workshop. And so once they'd undertaken this, what the challenge was that each of the participants then came back to the Discord. They shared the photographs as screenshots within the Discord, and they had sort of like a communal discussion about that work. I'm going to pause this because having somebody talking whilst I'm trying to talk is actually really hard. So I'm going to shuffle that video away. Apologies that you didn't get to hear Gareth's dulcet tones during that, but we had moving images, which is something. So that sort of tour and that sort of moment was this really actually beautiful experience. It was the culmination, it was the final event that we had as part of Now Play This, and it had this sort of really sort of beautiful sort of feeling of sort of bringing people together in a sort of really unique space. And as I said before, sort of reflecting on the way that that experience felt, is that it was not the same as being on a real world sort of field trip or in a real world sort of experience. It's something different, and it's something that chimed with me in an article that I really recommend people looking to is Michael Connor from Rhizome's article, which is part of a series that is looking at sort of the history of curating online, which is something that he started writing sort of at the beginning of the pandemic, especially as a lot of people's interest turned towards virtual exhibitions. And saying that the online exhibition is best understood as distinct from and connected to the embodied and situated experiences of practitioners, the public, and even the gallery world. And just sort of again, sort of understanding that you can't fully disconnect the real world from the virtual, but you cannot fully sort of lay them on top of each other. These different experiences and different emotional experiences sort of bounce and interplay off each other. So the second project that I'm going to sort of hopefully sort of quickly talk through, and I also understand that you're going to be having one of these as part of the conference. So so you won't be getting any FOMO when I'm talking through this, because you'll be able to take part in your own sort of spreadsheet party. And so this was a project that was not part of my professional curatorial practice. This was something that I did out of, I think, a desire at the beginning of lockdown and towards early on in the pandemic to foster and have a different sort of social experience. And it was at the point when I think there was a very heavy sort of intensive use of things such as Zoom, this very sort of reductive way. And I realize the irony when I'm talking about a lot of this and I'm doing this on Zoom, but, or the sort of the meta nature of the presentation, but that it was at a point when we were sort of relying on Zoom as this sort of crutch point of so many social experiences. And I feel like this very sort of reductive use of, reductive sort of impression of what social experiences are, that there are very few social experiences where it is just my face and your face and we're just talking to each other. Even in a restaurant, we have sort of food in front of us as some sort of social conduit to sort of break down the experience and to give us some sort of context to being somewhere else. And so in order to keep transcending that idea of sort of our work tools merging with our social lives, I decided that wouldn't it be funny to do a party in a shared Google Doc. Technically it's a Google Sheet, as pedants pointed out to me on the internet after I wrote about it. But yeah, so this was essentially a shared spreadsheet that was not sort of hugely publicly accessible. It was something that I made available to friends and friends of friends. So it was within a specific community of peers and people. It was a shift from it acts sort of like as a shift from looking at the virtual world of the photography field trips, that suddenly we're in a much more sort of speculative environment. We're in something that much less literally translates or represents the real world. And I think for me as well, this was also just a desire to say that I was missing, a desire that came out of missing the quiet spaces that we have from being together, and sort of realizing that actually sometimes there's different ways that we have of being around other people that doesn't involve constant communication. It's just this need to sort of silently exist. And so it was a way of also enabling sort of being social, but without being social sort of vocally or visually, or sort of being able to see each other. And also to sort of echo sort of Michael Connor's point, the spreadsheet is a party which knows it's a party in a spreadsheet, but knows it's in a spreadsheet, but also knows it's a party. And also to note as well, I am not the first person to have attempted to do a party in a spreadsheet. This wasn't directly inspired by any others, but since doing this and writing about it, many people have told me about others that have taken place, and many others have happened sort of either inspired by it or sort of differently connected to it. So turns out that lots of great minds think alike on hosting social events in spreadsheets. So, so the party sort of started, so I did provide some context to this space. There was a front door when people first arrived at the party, which was very much sort of British context, sort of, it looked like the front door of a cul-de-sac of a party at some point, like maybe sort of on a rainy October day. And people were welcomed into the party. So I didn't put too much sort of context around it. So I only had a couple of sheets at the beginning. And the rules sort of stipulated to people that they were allowed to sort of do what they wanted within the spreadsheet. There wasn't any sort of limitations above sort of behavior and conduct to say that people were allowed to sort of start spreadsheets, they're allowed to interact, that there wasn't really a prescribed way of how to exist, that this was partly an experience of us co-creating together and role-playing within the sheet. And so the party started out, as all parties do, in the hallway, with people people just sort of introducing themselves to each other and chatting. And of course, people were coming into this anonymously, which meant that, as Google Sheets has, that you have the little sort of anonymous animals. So everybody sort of, when they first arrive, is desperate to find out which anonymous animal they are. And so you ended up with this spreadsheet that sort of populates all the way down of different people sort of scribbling their, like frantically typing their name into a spreadsheet, asking what animal they are and desperate to find out. And you end up with this strange sort of archive of different people, sort of when you look back over the spreadsheet, sort of finding out which animals they are and desperately asking. And then the party, again, as all parties, or at least parties in the UK do, sort of then shifted into the kitchen, which is where everybody crammed. At this point, people started cut and pasting different foods that they found on the internet. Somebody brought some Percy pigs. Somebody brought a punch bowl. Somebody brought a pineapple and cheese hedgehog. And also, as a dutiful host, I also laid out some ASCII cups. And it was sort of one of the things that's interesting, sort of experiencing the party as well as looking back on it afterwards, is that this strange sense that whilst people, because everybody is there typing in the sheet at the same time, the only real metric that you have of who is present in that experience is the number of animals that it states sort of at the top. And so when you're communicating to people, you're jumping around from sheet to sheet with this sort of same anxiety you do at a regular party, wondering where people are. Am I in the room where all the best things are happening? Are people having more fun next door? And instead what you see is sometimes you happen upon people typing, or sometimes you sort of stumble upon the echoes of a conversation. But what's interesting is that no voice, no writing belongs really to any one person apart from in the moment or in the time when it's being written. Because when you come back to that, as soon as somebody clicks away from that cell, there is no longer sort of a record or any information which tells you who was communicating this or to whom and what was happening. And so when you're digging around this spreadsheet, you sort of have this sense of this collaborative role-playing experience that is gradually building up these layers and layers of interaction. So it's a party that's leaving a physical trail of all conversations that are happening, that are sort of visual within the space as it's occurring. But as well, it was also interesting to note that the same anxieties and complexities of being at a real world party can persist. That sense of missing out, that sense of wondering if you're butting into somebody's conversation. But with these experiences and with that desire to recreate these spaces, I wouldn't say that evoking negative reactions or reactions that we would perhaps think as being negative reactions in the real world are necessarily bad things to recreate and evoke. And at the beginning of lockdown, I really had a nostalgia for those feelings. Like, what's it like to be at a party and to feel awkward and to not know which conversations to start or which rooms to go into? And it was interesting, a space that looks so visually different and with such a different context to a house party was managing to evoke those feelings. And towards the end of the night, what started to happen was much more sort of creative emergent behavior. The need sort of for conversation and communication began to die down, and people sort of instead would sort of hide away sort of at the extremities of different sheets, sort of undertaking different acts of creation. And this was one of the last places that people hung out in this spreadsheet, which was a conditional formatting paint by numbers, which somebody had set up. And so it was really nice coming onto this page. It was a bit like finding a finger painting party or a finger painting room in your house party somewhere, where everybody had suddenly decided to stop and undertake sort of a period of arts and crafts. But it was really interesting to note and to observe the way that different sort of behaviors changed over the course of the evening and different things were evoked. So those are two projects and sort of two examples of things that I've done online since sort of the real world context had been sort of removed from my practice. And the things that I'm interested in with these is thinking about sort of this desire to explore spaces which are more abstract and more speculative. And this is a tweet from Laturbo Avedon, who is an artist who has undertaken a great deal of work, sort of undertaking virtual exhibitions, and is somebody whose work, who's a real sort of pioneer within this space. And they were just sort of tweeting recently about their reflections on the way that most galleries and spaces have been responding to the pandemic and responding to creating virtual exhibitions. And they were reflecting on their work creating Panther Modern, sort of an online gallery space several years ago. And just sort of questioning, like, why are we still so bound? Why are galleries still so bound to recreating the physical constraints and the complexities and sort of returning to these quite sort of traditional literal translations of exhibition sites online? And for me, I think I can understand sort of both sides of this desire to want to move a conversation forward, but also understanding the needs of perhaps creative practitioners and audiences who are just becoming more comfortable with this and accepting of this, to kind of need to start in a place that they are familiar with or that they sort of understand. And my hope is, and I think as with many questions that make sort of much more experienced practitioners in many different creative mediums roll their eyes, I think that this is a conversation and a complaint which is going to keep recycling around for sort of years and years to come. But understanding that there will always be practitioners who are more radical, who are paving the way in different directions, but there will always be people that are needed to sort of be brought up to that part in where sort of more radical thinking is. And for me, this has been a period of really experimenting, starting in more literal experiences and ending up in these more speculative places that have allowed me to sort of explore different emotions in different contexts. And I'm curious to know sort of how that's going to develop in years, that whilst we might not always have the same sort of conditions that we're operating under with regards to the pandemic sort of 2-3 years from now, we do have a range of curators and practitioners and artists who are much more confident and much more comfortable now with this language and existing in these spaces. And just to end, I just kind of wanted to refer to a couple of other spaces across games which have also been undertaking really interesting sort of work over 2020. There is also Laturbo Avedon's work, Your Progress Will Be Saved, which was with Manchester International Festival, which recreated the Manchester Factory venue within Fortnite. There is the work of Paolo Pedicini, who runs a gallery space, a small sort of video game, experimental video game gallery space in Portland, who has been undertaking a series of sort of increasingly more sort of speculative experiments with creating different gallery spaces online. There is Amaze, the festival in Germany, in Berlin, which this year sort of went totally digital, and they had as their sort of virtual hub, this sort of virtual brutalist exhibition space that was populated by flamingos. There's of course all of the different sort of attempts and ways in which people have created different galleries and different exhibitions with Animal Crossing this year. And lastly, I think also just the space which I'm finding that I'm spending more of my late stages of pandemic sort of isolation with is in Roblox. And this has been sort of one of the most sort of enjoyable and enriching community sort of experiences or social experiences that I've had. So I thoroughly recommend spending time sort of getting together with a group of friends just to plummet the depths of some of the strange and wonderful things that are in Roblox, that strikes this really wonderful blend of having sort of spaces which do not have sort of such intensive gameplay demands, but that are just enough to provide a context and a conduit for different social experiences, and also often really do push this idea of, I guess, sort of this transcendence of being both the creator and the player, and also the audience member. And so I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to wrap up with my sort of last thoughts here, that for me, the things that I'm sort of finding myself thinking about sort of towards the end of this period is one sort of this sort of strange feeling of transcending of roles. And the more I question about what it is that I want from virtual exhibitions and online exhibitions, the more I've begun to find myself asking questions which sound more like basic probing of what video games are and what video game design is. And so when I'm thinking about creating a real world exhibition, I'm thinking about creating a site within which people will navigate, people will find meaning, people can interact in different ways. When you translate that into a virtual context, how far are we actually getting away from what an exhibition is towards potentially what is actually a video game? And it's strange to feel sort of like, as a curator of games, suddenly realizing that I can no longer draw a sort of hard and fast line between my work as a curator and where I've transcended potentially the role of as a game designer or as an artist. And I know equally people, different artists during this period have talked about experiences feeling that that's sort of gone the other way from them, that they suddenly feel that they're occupying the role of the curator. So there's that sense of sort of transcending roles, and the way that the push to the virtual has sort of been a catalyst for that, for me specifically. But also, like, to end on a note that, and I think I understand it's probably problematic to sometimes talk about the field within which you're sort of an expert in, or that you spend most time in terms of being sort of exceptional or having this sort of exceptional abilities. But I think that there is definitely something with being a curator who, or being a curator and other curators who are familiar with and comfortable with video games and are comfortable with spaces, that we are very comfortable existing in virtual worlds and existing in social contexts, which are not necessarily striving to be sort of the most efficient way of doing things. We're seeking to create different emotional experiences. They can be broken, they can be sort of explorative, they can be speculative. And that is something which I think is really interesting to think about when we think about developing online exhibitions and future exhibitions, and just thinking, and I guess also asking the curators who are comfortable with games and are thinking about their spaces to really think about how you can apply that sort of thoughts and those processes to the exhibitions that you're creating, and thinking and rethinking sort of what exhibitions can be and what virtual spaces can be for going forward. So yeah, so that is a range of various musings from me that have been sort of spurred from undertaking photography workshops for Spacemen and parties in Spreadsheets during 2020. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marie. I think I'm the only one clapping because I'm the only one unmuted, but there are some clap emojis and various people making hand gestures on the videos. That was really amazing. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. We have time for a quick question if someone has one, but we also have a new Keynotes channel where people can post some discussion afterwards, and maybe Marie might have time to have a look at, see if there are any questions there later on. If we don't have a question, I do have one quick thing that I wanted to ask, which was, in a paradise where, you know, this is all over one day and you can go back to doing exhibitions the way you used to, maybe, if that happens, is there anything that you take away and keep with you from the things that you've had to do this year? Like, is there something that you're like, actually, this was great, you know, I'm so happy that we did this?
Yeah, I'm really happy that my hand was pushed to reconsider sort of what value exists in virtual and online exhibitions, and to really push myself to properly sort of familiarize myself with the creators and curators who are undertaking this work sort of previously. It's something that has definitely impacted the way that I think about why I'm a curator. And so I think it's going to be impossible for me to separate the experiences and thinking that I've gone through this year from my future practice. And it's something which, for things that I'm planning in the future, which whilst it might be sort of inadvisable, I am obviously hoping of a future where we will be able to have sort of site-specific real-world exhibitions again in future. And there's already ways in which I can see that about the ways in which we can potentially look towards hybrid experiences, but it's hard for me to pinpoint. But I think actually the thing is just sort of perhaps the embrace of the speculative and really rethinking the way that you can convey different experiences and taking more confidence to pull from video games, not just into online exhibitions, virtual exhibitions, but also into real world exhibitions as well.
Thank you so much, Marie. It was super inspiring. The chat is full of messages of people saying the same. We really appreciate you coming along. I'm sure that the recording will be appreciated by everyone else as well. Let's have one final show of emoji and hands for Marie, and then we'll move on to the next session. And yeah, feel free to put some comments in the Discord as well if you want to message Marie. She is on the Discord as well. Thank you again, Marie. That was amazing.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.